When people ask me where I'm from, I wonder whether I should give them the short or the long answer. I'm from Denmark, or I'm from Denmark, but my mom is from China and my dad is from Iran. When I was younger, I mostly gave the long answer to prevent people from asking me where I was really from, since I don't look Danish. But now I give the long answer because I'm proud. My parents each came to Denmark in their 20s and have since built a happy life together. My mom works as a financial consultant, and she's a strong-minded woman who makes the best dumplings, loves to buy new jackets, and always wants to travel somewhere warm. My dad runs a nursing home, and he loves his job. He cries at Disney movies, loves baking the same vegan, sugar-free cake every week, but he can also do 100 push-ups in less than 2 minutes. Thank you. If you meet him, you will remember him as kind. I've gotten so used to our life, so sometimes I forget that my parents had a life before me, and before they came to Denmark. I still don't know everything about their pasts, but what I know has changed the way I look at life. My dad grew up in a city called Tabriz in northern Iran. He was 8 years old when the Iranian Revolution began, and from one day to the next, his world completely changed. He was no longer allowed to see his female friends at school, and men were forced to grow beards. Things like music, alcohol, and poetry were suddenly illegal. My dad's family was poor, especially during the war against Iraq, which introduced new struggles like food rations. One of the first stories I heard about my dad's childhood was how he'd wake up at 4 a.m. every day to get bread for his family. He'd queue outside for 3 to 4 hours just to get a few loaves. And he used to sleep directly on concrete floor with his 5 siblings every night because they couldn't afford beds. It was only when he came to Denmark at the age of 20 that he finally got a bed of his own. On his way to school, it was normal to see dead bodies hanging in the streets or people being beaten to death in broad daylight. At night, the war was still raging, with bombs hitting the area a few times a week, making it nearly impossible to sleep. Only a child, my dad was faced with poverty, war, and chaos nonstop. One of the most terrifying moments from his childhood happened when he was 10 years old. One afternoon, someone called the neighbor, since my family didn't have a phone, and they asked for my grandpa. They told him, "I'm risking my life telling you this, but the authorities are going to raid your house tonight." Immediately, they rushed to clear the house of anything that could be deemed as treason. Alcohol, music, books, films, everything went into large black bags. My dad recalls being almost paralyzed with fear as he had to carry the bags outside in the pitch black night to throw them into the nearest river. Later that night, as expected, the authorities came and searched their entire house. Luckily, they found nothing. But if they'd found anything, even just a single book, they could have imprisoned, or worse, killed my dad's whole family right there and then, and I wouldn't be here today. My dad has had so many near-death experiences. It's a miracle he's even alive today. When he was a teenager, he was almost arrested for wearing a denim jacket because it was deemed too Western. He wanted his kids to have a better life than that, to be free enough to be a child. So he went beyond frontiers for me and my brother before we even existed. Meanwhile, more than 6,000 kilometers away, my mom was growing up in China during the Cultural Revolution. She was 8 years old when the Chinese leader Mao died. The day he died, she stood inside a big hall with the rest of her school to mourn him. She had to stand there and cry in command the whole day for 9 hours straight. Like my dad, my mom also grew up poor. The Cultural Revolution involved the ruthless persecution of intellectuals and other people who seemed to dissent from the government. My grandpa had been a lawyer, but he'd been stripped of his status and job before my mom was born. He'd been exiled to a province meant for nobodies, which is where he met my grandmother. He would have been sent to a labor camp if it wasn't for his ability to paint, and his new job became writing huge propaganda slogans. It was the only way he could survive. All his lawyer friends had been sent to labor camps, and he never saw them again. So from before my mom was even born, her father had been labeled as a rightist and a traitor. The whole town seemed to be against them. My mom and her siblings were often bullied in school, and one time, some boys were picking on her little brother. They were peeing on him, and she tried to defend him, but they ended up beating her with metal rods. She was only 9 years old and condemned because her father had been an intellectual 20 years before. To this day, she still has scars on her shins. My grandma spent 2 hours walking to work every single day instead of taking the bus, just to save the equivalent of a few pence. Their family was so poor that a neighboring couple had offered to buy my mom in exchange for a bike. A bike was so rare and expensive at the time, and as the couple had said, it would get my grandma to work much faster. Back then, it wasn't unheard of to buy children like that in China, but my grandparents refused. My grandma had said that she'd rather die and would never sell her daughter, not for a bike, not for anything. But that's the kind of childhood my mom had, marginalized and treated like dirt. Her dad's past as an intellectual had followed her relentlessly, like a cloud of misfortune. Now I understand why she wanted to start over, why she left China and came to Denmark. It was to give herself a second chance to be free. One of the biggest life lessons I've learned from my parents, which I'm still trying to remind myself of every day, is how lucky I am. How lucky we all are to be here, to be able to wear denim and take the bus and to have a bed to sleep in. Until a few years ago, I thought that my dad had taught my mom how to love. When I was a kid, my mom told me that when she was growing up, physical affection was looked down upon, regardless of whether it was romantic, platonic, or familial. It's not because they didn't love each other, but because they were taught to believe that strength meant showing no emotions. So as a kid, I'd imagined this almost fairy tale-like story where my dad had been the first person to show my mom affection and shown her how to love. But now I've realized it's more true the other way around. I've already told you that when my dad was 8 years old, the Iranian Revolution began. But I didn't tell you that when my dad was 8 years old, another living nightmare also began. From when he was 8 to 16 years old, my dad was sexually abused by an older man. For 8 whole years. I hope that one day my dad can share this part of his story himself. In preparing for this speech, I sat down to talk to my parents so they could help fill in the gaps of what I already knew about their lives. My dad said that at one point in his life, he'd lost the ability to trust anyone, to love anyone. He'd resolved to being ice cold. But when he met my mom, he started opening his heart up again. She gave him a life full of love and trust, a life worth living. He told me if I hadn't met her, I don't know where I would have ended up. When my dad was 16 years old, he was at his lowest point in life. It was like there was nothing left for him. He'd been abused for 8 years without anyone knowing or noticing his pain, and it felt like it was his destiny, that he was doomed to be miserable for the rest of his life. He started doubting if he should even live anymore. One day, he went to a park and sat for 2 hours just thinking to himself, this can't be the real world. It must be a bad dream. He was so lost and considered whether he should jump in front of a car or run away. That's when he decided to join the military. At 17, he researched the different camps, wanting to go to the worst one. He told me that he wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't a coward or die trying. So he ran away before he turned 18 without telling anyone, not even his own family. And he was sent to the most dangerous camp on the border between Iran and Iraq, a place where other people broke their own arms with rocks in the hopes of being sent home. But my dad stayed for 2 years. It was the only thing that saved him from taking his own life. And those 2 years were grueling, but they changed him because he finally discovered his own strength. One of his military duties was to report from the camp to the head base every week. It was a 3.5-hour walk, so he sometimes got a ride from another unit. But it was dangerous because they were exposed in the road, so the car would have to keep moving at a high speed, and my dad would have to jump out of the moving truck. One time, he landed and fell hard on both of his ankles, severely twisting them both. The truck, of course, had already driven away, so my dad was in agony, all alone. The nearest village was around 5 kilometers away, and the journey seemed endless. He staggered as he tried to walk on his twisted ankles. Every step was a shock of pain, but he survived. It's only now that I realize just how important it was for my dad to keep going, to survive through the physical pain. He'd gone to the military to prove to himself that he was strong, and this is one of the times where he did that. In my past 2 years at Oxford, I've actually often thought of that story. Sometimes I would feel overwhelmed by all the deadlines, difficult essays, and feelings of insecurity. And I would just think of my dad walking on his twisted ankles. It sounds like a ridiculous comparison, and it is, but that's the point. I'm not in a life or death situation. I'm not forced to bite through excruciating pain, but in fact very privileged to sit at my desk and worry over a 2,000-word essay on Shakespeare. Of course, I still have my own struggles, and they're still legitimate, but most of my worries seem minuscule in comparison to what my parents have endured. And it's not that I'm comparing myself to their hardship in order to undermine my own, but rather because it's important to put things into perspective. There are 2 lessons my dad has taught me since I was young. Don't make yourself the victim, and don't give up. Despite his suffering, my dad has always kept going and never wanted others to feel sorry for him. He could have easily resigned himself into being a victim, but where would that have left him? When my dad came to Denmark, he wanted to create a better life for himself, but it wasn't easy. He arrived at Copenhagen Airport in 1991 with no possessions except for the clothes he was wearing. It was a freezing October, and he was wearing flip-flops because he'd sold his shoes on the journey to afford food. But after a few years, he learned Danish and met my mom. He was set to start studying at a Danish gymnasium, and he wanted to go to university. He still struggled, but at least he felt hopeful. Most of his family had made it to either Denmark or Sweden, and it was just his dad who was still in Iran, but he was going to join them all soon. In August 1994, just when my dad had started settling down in Denmark, and just 2 weeks before he was going to start gymnasium, he received heartbreaking news. His dad had died. In fact, he'd been murdered. It was just a few weeks before he was supposed to come to Sweden. He'd already sold all the furniture and had prepared to sell the house in Iran. To this day, we still don't know who killed him, but they'd done it in cold blood and stabbed him 38 times in the chest, right in his own garden. Who would do that to an old, innocent man? When writing this speech, I asked my dad, "How did you keep going?" He told me that he wanted to make his dad proud. After the initial shock and grief, he tried to channel his pain into strength. Time wouldn't stop for him, so he had to keep going. He wanted to finish his education, get a job, and start a family. He'd gone through too much to give up now. When I told my dad about this talk, he decided to look at the letters his dad had sent him from Iran. He hadn't even touched those letters in over 20 years. He took one out and started reading it aloud, maybe for my sake, maybe more for his own. He uttered the first two words, Farzand mehrabanam, my kind child. And he immediately broke into tears. Seeing him cry like that, he seemed so vulnerable to me. I imagined his 23-year-old self, who had just lost his dad when his life had finally started to turn around. There's still so much sorrow, so I'm not telling anyone to just get over the pain or grief you might be experiencing, especially when I've seen my dad is still grieving after 26 years. But I want to instead emphasize the power of my dad's advice to never let yourself feel like a victim, to not feel sorry for yourself, but to instead focus on the things you have and the things you can do. Luckily, my dad had already met my mom when my grandpa died. So he tried to focus on building a future with her and their future children, my brother and me. My parents are the strongest people I know. Every time I think of the struggles they've overcome, I realize again just how lucky I am. I could have very easily not existed. My dad could have very easily died. He could have been killed by bombs, shot in the military, or died fleeing Iran. My mom could have gone to a different city in Denmark, and they could have very easily not met. And so my parents remind us that every day is a gift, a blessing. Whoever you are, I hope you use the opportunities you've been given to fulfill your potential and to be happy. My parents' stories have always empowered me, and I hope they've inspired you too. I'd like to leave you with the ending of my grandpa's last letter to my dad. We've tried our best to translate it. Always, I put my feet in the stirrups on the horse of imagination. I gallop towards you and draw you in my embrace. And when I kiss you, my dears, one by one, I become younger and younger, retrieving my lost years. Forever, I'm the one who will never forget you. Thank you.